This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. They called him Rocco. He'd worked at some of the best restaurants in town till he got caught trying to hijack a tractor trailer full of pâté de foie gras and ended up behind bars, sharing a cell with my buddy. It seemed all the guy read was cookbooks and gourmet magazines. He loved to talk about all the fine cuisine and the fancy foods he used to whip up. He'd go on for hours and hours talking about this soup and that sauce. Food was his whole life. My guys in prison got pinups on the walls, and so did Rocco. Only his pinup was of a rack of lamb with little panties, of course. Now, our prison chow was this greeny gray stuff that smelled like old socks. Rocco refused to eat it, said it gave food a bad name, that it offended the palate. One day when they dumped that slop on his tray, he tossed it right back into God's kisser. That little episode started the mother of all food fights. That's when Rocco went into solitary and started his hunger strike. He weighed like 300 pounds when he first went in the hole, but in the next few months, he lost more than half of it. So one night, there was this big thunderstorm with lots of lightning that lit up the sky like a gigantic fireworks. A bolt of lightning hit a transformer in one of those electrical substations. Anyway, there was a big bang, and then all the lights went out. Now, while this was all going on, it just so happened that a guard was bringing Rocco his meal, and the blackout surprised this guard, so Rocco could jump him and lock him in the cell. He snuck out into the prison yard where he almost got caught by the guards, but lucky for Rocco, guards can't see in the dark. So, Rocco made it over the wall and escaped into the woods. That night, Rocco saw a truck driver who pulled over on a back road for a pit stop. When Rocco opened the back door, he saw lots of real fancy-looking, good-tasting food inside. It was a caterer's van, and a fancy caterer, too. Rocco's eyes lit up, and he slobbered drool like it was water from a spigot. But just as Rocco was reaching for a platter of them hors-d'oeuvre things, the driver finished his business, got back in the truck, and drove away. Rocco was drenched to the skin and bones. A lot later that night, he saw this deserted building, but inside it was pitch black. So he stumbled around in the dark, knocking stuff over and falling down a lot. But then he thought he'd gone to heaven when he bumped into a fridge. It was chock full of plastic containers of food. He couldn't see, of course, but he also couldn't taste or even smell what was getting a cold and a stuffed-up nose from being out in the rain for so long. All he cared about was that it was a fridge and that there was food inside. He was licking his lips like he was about to sit down to a fancy spread at some 4-star French joint. Of course, maybe his taste buds would have thought doink tasted good. I don't know. He peeked out and stuffed his face. It was like in one night he gained back all the weight he lost. Did he ever feel good? Good and stuffed. Anyways, it was still dark, and since he was real full and real pooped, he fell asleep. When he woke up, it was morning, and Rocco could see. His eyes bugged right out of his head, because on the fridge there was this big notice. Caution, warning, dangerous. This laboratory cooling unit contains materials for medical and scientific experiments. So Rocco pulled the door wide open. The fridge was full of really gross stuff. Parts and pieces of, I tell you what, but I don't want to make you sick. And nearly everything from that fridge was now in Rocco's gut. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And Rocco, he's back in prison. And these days, he eats anything they put in front of him.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of actually a neighbor of mine. Nobody can say that Patty Pringle isn't a good neighbor. And what people do in the privacy of their own backyards is their own affair. Like I said, I don't meddle. So when I saw that my next-door neighbors, the Taylors, were planning a big barbecue, I said, fine. I hope they get good weather for it, even if I'm not invited. But when I happened to peek out my upstairs window that overlooks their backyard, you know, the one you have to stand on the chair to see out of, I saw that Mrs. Taylor was going to be serving salmon, a whole grilled salmon. And at $12 a pound, who's she trying to impress? And it certainly wasn't my business when I saw their cat, Muffy, jump up on the picnic table and start to nibble on the salmon. Luckily, Mrs. Taylor came outside and caught that stupid cat in the act. Anyway, by the time I came downstairs onto my patio, I could hear Mrs. Taylor having a hissy fit. Look what that stupid cat's done! My dinner's ruined! Well, the first thing she did is grab the cat and hand it over to her precious little Emerson. Now, Emerson's going on and on about how the cat has eaten the eyes out of the salmon and how the cat's chewed up half the salmon's face. And would you believe Mrs. Taylor, just as cool as a cucumber, told Emerson not to say a word to anybody at the party? Mrs. Taylor told him that she'll fix the salmon by decorating it with parsley. Imagine disguising a chewed-up salmon with parsley. Mrs. Taylor and Emerson shook hands and zipped their lips on their little secret. I had to go out for an hour around 5, you know, when the grocery store marched down the baked goods. When I came back, the Taylor's party was in full swing. Cars parked everywhere, an awful mess. How was I even supposed to get into my own driveway? Well, as long as they were having a good time, what did it matter? Everybody, and there must have been 20 very loud people there, as if one extra person me would have made a big difference. They were just raving about the dinner. Great salmon. Oh, this fish is amazing, Jenny. You must give me the recipe. I've never had fish this tasty. Well, they've never had my stewed catfish, that's for sure. And there was Mrs. Taylor, just soaking in the compliments, when Emerson came running up to her. Mom, I've got to tell you something. Well, Mrs. Taylor tried to shoo him away, but he kept tugging at her arm. Finally, he just blurted it out. Mom, Muffy ate the fish and now she's dead. Well, you should have seen Mrs. Taylor's face. I'll tell you one thing, her underwear and fine delicates never come out that white on the wash line. Now everyone started screaming about poison salmon. The shrieks and cries from that backyard, people wretchedly begging, rushing to the hospital to get their stomachs. Not what I would call a very successful dinner party. The next day I happened to see Mrs. Taylor and Emerson in the backyard. I popped my head over the fence and asked how things had gone the night before. A disaster. Everybody hurling and spewing, said rude little Emerson. Their friends won't even speak to them now, said Mrs. Taylor. And if that's not enough, the cat is dead. Oh, by the way, I said about Muffy. Last night driving back from the market, I ran over your cat. I didn't want to disturb your big fancy party, so I just left the poor little thing on your porch. Nobody can say that Patty Pringle isn't a good neighbor. This is a true story. It happened to a neighbor of mine, which is probably why the Taylors don't serve fish for dinner anymore.
Now, this is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Jenny loved to bundle newsprint. She was a real compost queen, you know? Unfortunately, her family was the most wasteful bunch of garbage grunts on the planet. Every Saturday, Big Bill, that's Jenny's dad, would be out in the backyard stoking up his huge briquette-burning barbecue for the weekly weenie roast. Bill was a big fan of Maxi Franks, 18 inches long, big, fat, and greasy. Every Saturday, Big Bill got the grill going good. Then Cheryl, that's Jenny's mom, would come out on the deck dragging a box of frozen Franks the size of a small dumpster. Now, the Maxi Franks people, see, they loved packaging almost as much as Bill loved their weenies. A Maxi Frank box could fill a double-sized green garbage bag all on its own. Bill and Cheryl didn't even like to think about garbage. You put it in green plastic bags, tossed it out on the front sidewalk, and it went away. But where does it go? Jenny would demand. Just away, Big Bill would reply. Have another hot dog. One day, Jenny tells her dad, I'm never gonna eat another Maxi Frank, ever. And she switches to a diet of raw vegetables. Big Bill and Cheryl freak out. I mean, without animal protein, they were sure their daughter would waste away. They had to get her back to eating good, nutritious Maxi Franks. But how? Then, Big Bill remembers a commercial he saw on TV. It was all about a new theme park, the Maxi Frank's Weenie Wonderland. So Big Bill piles them into the family car. An hour later, they pull up in front of a hot dog the size of an incinerator stack. And on top, there was a big neon sign that said, Welcome to Weenie Wonderland. Man, you would not believe this place. In the middle of all the attractions was a huge square filled with barbecue pits around a monster fun bun fountain. And everyone who worked there was dressed up like plastic mustard and ketchup bottles. And the rides, bratwurst bumper cars, sausage scramblers, and red-hot roller coasters. Oh, and of course, the Maxi Frank merry-go-round. And everybody, but everybody was chowing down barbecued hot dogs. And the waste! Jenny was horrified. Half-eaten hot dogs and mangled buns littered the grounds. She decides she's gonna find the head office and register a complaint. And Big Bill, well, he had to keep Jenny happy if he expected her to start eating meat again, so he went along. Then Jenny spots a building behind the pickle pavilion. Jenny wanted to check it out to see if this was where she could make her complaint. Big Bill didn't think it was a good idea, especially when a couple of big armed guards told him to move along. So Jenny and Bill get themselves a couple of costumes. They fall in line behind a bunch of theme-dressed workers and slip right by the guards. So Jenny and Bill walk down this long, snaking corridor and come out in a big modern factory with huge pipes pumping some kind of mush into big open vats. High-pressure hoses squirted the stuff into long, limp hot dog skins. Well, Big Bill's in seventh heaven. But suddenly, there was a shout, and Big Bill saw this nasty-looking security guard running towards him. They go racing down another long corridor, through another door, and then hello! They were standing in this huge concrete bunker full of trucks, dumping garbage and stuff into one great big pile. The smell was awful. Big Bill got dizzy and upchucked all over the place. Jenny had to help her dad out, but not before he saw the sign on the door. Makers of the Maxi Frank. Yeah, it's a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And Big Bill, well, he still barbecues every week. But now he's cremating corn, braising beets, and, toasting tofu.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Mike was a stock boy at the local supermarket. It wasn't a bad job, as far as jobs go, but it was pretty boring. Loading groceries onto the shelves and sweeping the floors. Sometimes he'd help the checkout girls bag groceries. Not all the checkout girls, just the hot ones. Anyhow, one day Mike was stocking the shelves, following that old stock boy's rule of thumb of putting the fresh stuff at the back and the oldie moldies up front when he was called to the checkout. One of the customers needed help carrying her groceries. This particular customer turned out to be a granny, and she had a ton of bags with her. Things were starting to look up. You see, another of the stock boys' rules of thumb was that the value of the tip is directly proportional to the number of bags to be carried. Mike picked up the old granny's bags and carried them out to the parking lot. That's when Granny confessed that she didn't have a car and asked if he wouldn't mind carrying the bags back to her place. "It's just around the corner," she said. It didn't take an Einstein to figure out that the old lady'd probably be so grateful she'd give him a really humongous tip. So Mike said, "Sure." So they started walking. That's when Mike realized that just around the corner was kind of an understatement. This granny lived at least a mile from the store and uphill all the way, through a strange, gingerbready kind of neighborhood. The whole place was like Granny City. "Not too heavy for you, is it, Sonny?" asked Granny. Mike, drenched with sweat, grunted and shook his head no. "Mind the eggs, dear," she said. They finally got to her house. Mike dragged the bags up the front steps. He put the bags on the kitchen table and then collapsed into a chair. He was totally wiped. That's when Granny said, "You've been so kind. Let me get you something for your time and trouble. I'll be right back." This is what he'd been waiting for. As the old lady scurried into the back room, she called out, "You must be hungry. Why don't you fix yourself a snack? There's lots to eat in the pantry." Mike was starving now that she'd mentioned it. He got up and opened the pantry doors. It was dark and musty, filled with jars of things like jellied calf's livers and pig's knuckles. What other weird stuff would he find? Something gross, maybe? He knew he should stop looking, but he couldn't help himself. He was hungry. He opened a cupboard door and it rolled out at him. He was scared, but he caught it. It was nothing weird at all. It was just a small jar of mixed nuts. He popped some of the nuts into his mouth. They were pretty good, could have used some salt, but not too bad otherwise. They'd hold him till he found some real food. But there was nothing. Just jar after jar, shelf after shelf of yucky stuff like porpoise parts and monkey meat. Mike was getting the dry heaves just from looking at it. He decided to stick with the nuts, thank you very much. At least he knew nuts were safe. And before he knew it, he'd finished off the jar. Finally, Granny came back into the kitchen. "Here you go, dearie, something for your trouble." And she held out 15 cents. Mike took the money. "Gee, thanks, lady. Yeesh. All that work for nothing." But, on the bright side, he'd got a free snack out of it. "Oh, by the way," he said, "you had some mixed nuts in the cupboard? Sorry, I couldn't stop myself and I kinda ate them all." "Oh, that's all right, Sonny," Granny said with a kindly smile. "With the state of my teeth, all I can do is suck the chocolate off them anyway." Hey, it's a true story. Happened to a friend of mine. Yeah, Mike's still working at the supermarket, but he's added a new rule to the stock boys' rules of thumb. Never eat on the job.